Hello, fabulous students and superstars. Welcome for the second session with Maurice Fernandez. And today we are going to talk about Jupiter, of course, going into houses and signs. And let's welcome Maurice. Maurice, welcome back. How are you doing today? More than what you already said.
Overall, good. I'm working on feeling even better.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, we will send you healing vibes too. Hopefully, you will be better soon.
Can you hear me well? Everything's good with the mic.
Yeah, everything is good. So, Maurice,
I'm
just
going to
a
share
very,
my screen.
yeah, sure. Just I'm going to say something very quickly. Remember, guys, that we are offering the single classes for the May program, so you can go to Synchronicity University, find your favorite class. For example, for the speaker series, you can find your favorite speaker and support him or support her because all of them are women. So also for the classes with Nadia and Maurice, of course. With Humera, we just started her course this week. Yeah, all I think that's it for now. Remember sharing your questions in the Q&A box, and we can check them at the end or interact in the chat. Thank you, Maurice. I'm going to be around checking everything in the chat. I'll let you know if something there is very important. Bye bye.
Okay. So, welcome everyone. Good to continue. Let's begin just with quick questions. If there's anything that came up from the first session, we can, quickly address it if it's relevant. Um, but otherwise, yeah, I would like to recapture some of the key words. So you can type your questions in the meantime, and I will begin uh, going into the contents and then check on your questions. So I also want to refer you again to this video that's on my YouTube channel. On Sagittarius. And obviously, this also covers a lot of the meanings of Jupiter by association. So you will understand some of the things I talked about through this video as well. So we talked about, the keywords. I want to revisit them as we now dive into each sign. Sovereignty. So Jupiter represents wherever it is by house sign. It represents a sense of mastery, something that has been accomplished, something that, you are um, able to naturally tap into. So as a fire principle, essentially, it brings confidence and expertise and leadership. In that sense, the sovereignty also translates into where Jupiter is where we can become teachers. So it's where we find our teachers, but it is also how we, because of our life experience, because of our expertise, can share what we know. So it's natural wisdom and all of that. I write here grandchildren because it's significant in the sense that Jupiter represents how our children create children. And that is obviously biological. So why is that an issue? Why do we need to address issues about grandchildren? Because if your children are producing, if they are themselves continuing the line, it means that your legacy carries on. And this goes beyond the biological aspect. It's, for example, when you release a book. And so your book is your Leo creation, it's your child. But then people are inspired by your book and they write reference from it. They quote you. They write their own book that builds on yours. So that kind of continuation, that your creation has its own, its own continuity is part of Jupiter. It's the disseminating principle. I'm gonna have to actually take a break soon because I have to take some water. But um, until then, I'm sorry I forgot to bring water. Now, truth and authenticity. Wherever we have Jupiterian, Sagittarian themes, is where we need to find our voice. So if you were told that you're not smart enough, or what you say is not true, or that you were silenced for one reason or another, wherever your Jupiter lies is where you cannot be silenced, where people cannot suppress you, but especially as far as voice and truth speaking is involved. So if you have, for example, Jupiter in Capricorn or in the 10th house or Jupiter in Scorpio, this can represent the need to keep things secret, to not rush to speak up. On the other hand, if you have Jupiter in Aries, and we're going to start with that today, Jupiter in Aries are going to be so blunt. They are unstoppable truth tellers. And, there's something very radical about Jupiter in Aries. And again, there's something about it that cannot be restrained. And in a good way, it means you need to find yourself. You need to speak up. When we are now in the midst of the Epstein abuse scandal, and there's a lot about, when is the truth going to come out? We have some nuggets and some leaks and bits and pieces coming out, but um, there's a need to let the victims speak. So having the victims find their voice and actually share their stories is part of that Jupiterian liberation and release. There's also, when I do readings and I see that the person has their Jupiter repressed or their Jupiter that needs to be enhanced, one of the words to use is finding your voice, but it's also rewilding. Find your wild side because there's something very bestial, very primal about Jupiter. And that is part of that horse human symbolism that is extremely important because there's something very freeing when you rewild yourself. And that can be through spending time in nature. It can be through sexuality, recovering your sexuality, letting it out, exploring. So when I speak about rewilding, I'm also speaking about overcoming the fear of shame, the fear of criticism, of being overly self-conscious. Sagittarius naturally squares Virgo. Virgo tends to be self-critical for its own good reasons. But the tension between Virgo and Sagittarius is exactly that. It's micromanaging versus rewilding. So Sagittarian, Jupiterian types will be those who also want to rewild their lives. It's not just about, you know, walking naked in the forest. It's also about um, letting nature be free, conservation, allowing, water to flow through the rivers and wilderness thrive. So it shows up in all kinds of ways. Um, so if you combine both, one of the things you can encourage folks that need that lesson is scream therapy. Literally, make noise. Get it out of your lungs. You know, don't be afraid to disturb your neighbors. So that kind of approach is liberating. Of course, there's the other side of that is um, you often see that in the chart of Sagittarian, especially Moon in Sagittarius, where sometimes Mars in Sagittarius, where they may be born into families where one parent was very loud, screaming, exuberant, sometimes in a way that was too much, overbearing. So you can perhaps suspect situations where there were really vocal, loud arguments. So you have to kind of look into, as you look at a chart, how much volume do we need? Is it too low? Is the person always afraid and hiding? Or is it, deafening noise? And sometimes these folks who have strong Sagittarius felt ashamed of their family. So here we're kind of the square to Virgo. It can be like, I need to free myself from the shame, or maybe I need to restrain some of these wild people that lived in my household. And that can be, for example, not just screaming matches, but it can also be parents who have no boundaries, who burst into your room without knocking, who tell people things about you that you're embarrassed about. It's like, Mom, why did you share that with your friends? It's private. So from a Sagittarian point of view, there's nothing private. Everything needs to be known. And so there's an interplay between how loud do we need to be and how do we actually need to keep things more contained. Uh, it's part of that second phase negotiation. Um, could be one aspect of authenticity, something going overboard and becoming self-centered and perceived as arrogant. Yeah, I'll go over the question soon. Daring, expansion to the new frontier. So one of the things we need to understand is that Sagittarius and Jupiter represent the feeling that whatever is in your life, whoever you are, seems very limited and narrow. So that is part of the need to push boundaries because inwardly, wherever you have your Jupiter, you can feel extremely restricted. This can be the silencing, don't speak, don't be loud, or it can also be, the feeling that you are not making enough money or that you are lonely or that your job is not meaningful to you. So it begins with a sense of lack and deficiency and limitation that pushes you to try something else. So think about, a situation where you feel like you want to look for a new job. The reason why you're looking for a new job and you're maybe going to, sign up for a headhunting agency is because you feel restricted in your current job. So it comes from necessity. That's what I'm trying to say. And as you say to yourself, one of the virtues of Jupiter is that you have the intuition that this is not everything. Um, if I'm in a bad marriage, I know this is not the whole truth. I know this job is is not everything that I am. So it takes you to a place where you cannot just surrender or accept it and say, well, that's my lot, that's my fate. Remember what we talked about last week about fate and free will. And that now we come into the square between Sagittarius and Pisces. So Pisces says, this is life. This is your life. Deal with it. Sagittarius says, I'm not going to resign myself to this. I'm not accepting this as a final conclusion or a final word. So that need to push boundaries come from the free will factor and the knowing that life has more to offer. I can't resign myself to something limited. Now, Jupiter also represents Pisces. So there's a paradox there. But the Jupiterian aspect of Pisces is exactly that intuition that life is much vaster, it's much bigger than our mind can ever comprehend, but we have to start somewhere. So this ability to travel into the abstract potential, there's a potential to grow, there's a potential to live a better life, there's a potential to heal from my diseases, there's a potential for a better relationship. That feeling that you should try comes from Jupiter. And then the trine to Mars is when you actually take action, when you actually go and leave your comfort zone into an adventure because something in you knows that that's intuition. I don't know why, but I know. And so it's not coming always from facts or rational understanding. So remember that when you tell yourself there's more to life than this, the next question is how much more? You won't know until you try. This is why Jupiter, by definition, pushes you to make mistakes, right? Because you cannot know how far you can go until you go too far. So, how much pizza can you take? Somebody, gave you a tiny, tiny slice, and you felt like, one bite and it's over. That cannot be it. That's not my life. I want more pizza. And so I'm ordering a gigantic pizza because nobody's gonna tell me how much pizza I should have. And then, you go through half of it and you realize you're starting to burp and you're starting to have stomach reflux and it's not feeling so great. So that's the Jupiter play, is that you don't know ahead of time how much pizza you can take. That tiny slice was underwhelming. And so I need to try for myself. It's the same way that when we look at the ages of children, the Jupiterian activation of education is when the child tries to push the parents' boundaries. They push a little bit and they say, "Wow, mom agreed that I can play out all day. I didn't know if, you have to ask in order to see that it's possible." But then, I don't come back for dinner and I get reprimanded. So, the Jupiter in the child is that constant testing how far I can go. And it needs to be there. There needs to be some creative tug of war, creative tension between Saturn and Jupiter. Um, so that is also when you can get great success because you tried. And oh my God, you can fly. There is an opportunity. You applied for a job somewhere and they actually hire you and they send you places and you are excited. So think about the boost and the opportunity that not only comes to you, but that you create. This is the chart of Trump when he won the last election. And he had this big fat Jupiter on his North Node and Sun. So when all the odds were against him, he was facing court orders and convictions and life seemed to be closing on him um in from 2021 when Biden started his term. And so he said, I'm going to run again. And I won the last time and I'm going to do it. And he's obviously a South Node moon in Sagittarius. So this is for him very natural. Whatever is in your South Node is something that you're very habituated to you, something that is natural to you. That's where you come from. And so for him to push and to try and to say, I'm going to run again. And then now he's saying, I'm going to run a third time. But The Constitution says only twice, but that's a Jupiterian daring and pushing and saying, I'm not taking your word for gospel. I am going to push the boundaries and I'm going to do everything to run a third time. So that's a Jupiterian personality. And you may love it, you may hate it. That's what it is. Because he won one bet of being reelected. Maybe he's going to win another bet of being elected a third time. And of course, we know there are a lot of ethical consideration when Trump is involved. That goes back to his Saturn Jupiter square. What's right, what's wrong, remember. But that's an example of how people tell you no, and you don't take that as a final answer. Now, Jupiter in 2028 is going to be in Libra. So he's going to have a Jupiter return in Libra. Will that be this or will that be that? Will that be like, oh God, we have too much of this? Like let's turn down the volume because it's been too loud. Or, will he take another flight? Okay. Yeah. And so remember that what I want to highlight is that we all read about what's going on here. We all read about how Jupiter, can give a lot of opportunity, but I want you to understand where it's coming from. How does it work from a spiritual point of view? It comes from the necessity to defy what is predetermined, what seems to be, the norm. So you don't take no for an answer. And either you win or you lose your gamble, but it is a gamble. This is why, in this particular configuration, that's when you can create karma. You know, if Trump wants to win a third time, and if he cheats and manipulates the law to advance his ambitions, this is where fate and free will are interacting. And they need, to understand that you can't just rewrite the narrative without truth and consequence. So let's come back to this. What does that actually mean? Remember free will and fate. Remember that when Saturn Kronos was the sovereign leader, there was no need for laws. It was the golden age. Everything was in perfect harmony. This kind of paradise of no friction. And the reason was having no choice. So when you don't have choice, you don't make mistakes. And everything works according to divine order. The moment Jupiter comes in and gets the gift of fire, everything becomes chaotic because everyone wants to decide what's right and wrong, how far they can go, and they don't take orders from anyone else. So That is liberating to some extent, but it comes with the risk of karma. Now, the question is, and I know that's a deep question. It's an existential question, but I'm going to maybe risk asking you, why is it wrong to cheat? Why is it wrong to lie? Why is it wrong to manipulate the system so that you can stay in power for 6 terms and how many terms you want? Like, who and why do we get to this place where we say, no, that's wrong? Says who? Your grandma? Your high school teacher? The government? Is that the reference to rights and wrongs? It interferes with others' free will, flying too close to the sun. Absolutely. There's something very Jupiterian about um, Icarus flying too close to the sun. So, where does it come from? How do we eventually realize we shouldn't do that? Cheating disturbs the cosmic order, lying. Yeah. But, Heidi, you say Saturn, but what's Saturn role? Why is Saturn? I mean, Saturn can also be the priest who tells you not to masturbate. So Saturn is not enough of an answer to me because it's not necessarily coming from a reliable source. Scientists tell you that astrology is pseudoscience. They are Saturn. Does that mean it's true? Where is the karma coming from? We harm somebody goes beyond what is repaired. Against the principle of oneness. So let's go back to this image. I want to do whatever I want to do, but what happens then is that I get an indigestion. I get some kind of health problem. So the consequences are not just coming from somebody telling me you're eating too much pizza. It's coming from the fact that nature, the cosmos, is not aligned with this or excessive indulgence. So when I say, should I lie or not? Should I cheat or not? The question that Saturn brings is it sustainable? Is it sustainable on the longer run? Every earth sign represent lessons about sustainability. So if you're always eating ice cream and pizza, it's not going to be sustainable because your body will give out. You'll feel sick. Your bones will deteriorate. What I want to say basically is that you get a feedback mechanism from life itself, but the feedback is not always immediate because in the moment, you can feel great. All the big dictators were Jupiterian. I'm going to show it to you. But they ended up destroying the world, destroying people, and it was not sustainable. So this is why, this interplay between Jupiter and Saturn plays in, because Saturn brings fate, and Saturn brings the higher form of Saturn, brings that understanding that things cannot be according to our own wishful thinking. This is why when we enter the last quadrant, there's no more fire. So the last fire is Sagittarius and Jupiter. And then we enter the realm of fate, and we need to then align with something bigger than ourselves. So when we speak about karma, karma means that there is a sense of justice and a sense of right and wrong that is beyond human decision. And it is not negotiable. It's not something you can change. It's not something you can argue about. It is eternal. And here is why Jupiter interact with Neptune in a square. Because ultimately, as we start with Saturn, then goes to Uranus and then Neptune, Neptune represents the totality of what is eternal, of what is true, everywhere, always. It's true in the Middle Ages, it's true in the Egyptian cosmology, it's true in the 21st century. To cheat doesn't work. So it's not just a matter of, oh, it's annoying. It's a matter of it doesn't work. Because if everybody cheats, there is going to be complete chaos, anarchy in a negative sense, and a breakdown. So it's the end of civilization. It's the end of anything productive and constructive. So what the square to Neptune ultimately says is that there's wishful thinking, Jupiter, and there's truth, Neptune. There's my truth, Jupiter, and there's the truth, Neptune. And so karma is represented by Saturn, but this kind of interplay with karma is a Jupiter-Saturn tug of war. Thank you. We don't know who is trustworthy and how to trust. We are in the habit of lying to ourselves. It disorders the lens. We lose the sense of truth in the body. Absolutely. We don't have the absolute clarity to have the final word, to see the final truth, but we experience the truth. So it's beyond somebody telling me what's right and wrong. It goes to, does it work? So some people will say, talk about parents and teacher. There was this fellow, what was his name? James something. He wrote a book in 1970 that in order to, raise good kids, you need to spank them, especially girls. And so spanking means that they can learn what's right and wrong and that they can be good citizens and blah, blah, blah. So who am I to argue with that until we we see what happens to these kids who are spanked. Are they healthy? Are they functional? Are they drug addicts? Are they violent? Are they suppressed? And then I can say, well, this spanking doesn't work. It's not sustainable. On the other hand, we have parenting style where parents tell you, you decide, you do whatever you want. You know, can be in Pisces, or you can have a strong Jupiter. And so everything is permissive. Parents who give absolute autonomy to their children. And so if the kid doesn't want to go to school, if the kid doesn't want to eat, they are their own sovereign decision makers. And so that's another style of parenting that is, encouraging uh, permission. But ultimately, it is also tested that those kids don't do well as adults. They cannot cope with stress. They end up with higher rates of depression because they don't have the muscle to face adversity. Um, and in their own children mind and brain development, they're not equipped to see the whole picture, to be able to make all these decisions on their own. So we go back to that balance between one and the other. But as a third point, Jupiter is definitely the need to try, the need to test, the need to push boundaries so that we know how far is too far, how much freedom becomes detrimental, toxic. Um, my dad used to say, little pigs get fat, big pigs get slaughtered, meaning if you're acting a bit from the self-interest to take, it's beneficial, but not too much, you will get a consequence. Yeah, a good way to put that. Jupiter is also the law creating by society when a behavior outstripped public good. Um, yes, absolutely. And and here is an example of, we saw last week of when Jupiter is not only the legal and human law, but it's also um, natural law. This is another example. This is an ex-French president, Sarkozy, who was convicted of fraud and was sent to jail on his Jupiter return. So you'd think Jupiter return, opportunity. But in this case, it's facing the truth. Now, what we also notice, and that's why I often bring Saturn in the picture, is that along with his Jupiter return, he had an angular Saturn exactly on his ascendant. So usually when you have the consequence is when Jupiter makes an aspect to Saturn. Usually. And it can be a trine. You're still going to jail, especially if it's angular. So issues with integrity. Um, the interesting thing is that he was supposed to go to jail for, I don't remember what the sentence was, but at least a few months. And he was released after 2 weeks. So there was leniency because he was who he was. Um, you can say that's Jupiter, but still, it's it's interesting that the trial came to be right, and the sentencing, and all the timeline of this coincided with Jupiter activations that he ended up in jail after all. Um, More keywords: transition to the spiritual plane. When we look at the natural wheel, from Mars to Mars, from Aries to Scorpio, we are in the material world. We have descended spirit into flesh. We operate in the physical world. We make our life what it is: resources, home, family, marriages. Then we reach Scorpio. Scorpio is the first sign that make you feel like a deep crisis and sense that you're going to die. And this is the first experience of transcendence. Because as you face your own mortality, as you face your own end, as you face your own failures, you have the choice to change or to die. And that's where Pluto kicks in. That's why Pluto is the ruler of Scorpio with Mars. Because Mars carries you from Aries to Scorpio, but it doesn't carry you beyond Scorpio. You need Pluto to continue your journey from Scorpio to Pisces. Because the interplay between Mars and Pluto is the interplay of ego to soul. So that is when you realize your life is not only about the here and now, it's not only about making money and being safe and all the things that keep you alive. So the crisis of Scorpio forces you outside of your own everything, your own self, and opens the door to the transpersonal self. That's when you realize you're not just Johnny, you're not just Bridget. You are a soul. There's more to life than this. There's a greater meaning. And that's when Jupiter can finally come in and realize life is a larger continuum. We're all connected, all those spiritual realizations that there's more than the material world. So as Scorpio goes through this death and is forced to change, the change requires going deeper, looking at your life, looking at the deeper question. Why are you having this job? Why are you married to this person? Is that really who you are? What can you change to continue your journey? And and so think about the fact that for many children, attending a funeral is a spiritual encounter. Because when you face death, somebody else's death, somebody close to you, and or perhaps your own, if you're fighting a disease or if you had an accident and you were on the gates of death, it takes you to a transcendental place of realization that your life is more than what you always thought it was. So there's something about the spirituality being born from death. And we see that in the sequence. And we know how Jupiter can be optimistic and suddenly, right, you have faith. But it comes from where? It comes from a deep encounter with a crisis, with a failure, with a loss. So once Pluto did the work, you are recharged, you refuel your tank, and you're ready to go with Jupiter, feeling like I can do it. I am a survivor. I am confident now again. I reclaim myself. This is why there's mastery in Jupiter, because it's not just about going to school and learning a trade. It's going through death and surviving a lot of things that make you now understand the greater scheme of things. This takes us to another side of Jupiter where why people with faith are unstoppable. Do you ever ask yourself, how come somebody who is Jewish is going to experience a spiritual realization through Judaism, and somebody who is Christian is going to experience a spiritual bliss through Jesus? And then somebody who's a Buddhist is going to experience something so profound through Buddhism. And because of that, you think that your faith is the one because you experience such bliss, such liberation, such deep realization. It transformed you, it gave you meaning, and you saw the angel. I'm not just talking about, feeling good. I'm talking about somebody who was sick with cancer and prayed to Jesus and was saved. And another person prayed to Buddha or meditated and was saved. And another person prayed to God. And so everyone in their own spiritual system have the same results. And they are therefore convinced that their system is the system. But in fact, it's just one gateway. Because what matters is transcendence. It's not what the name of the prophet. So, yeah, Saturn is playing the long game. So I want to go back to just that key word of ecstasy and spiritual awakening. When you have a Jupiter transit, you could meet a teacher or realize something new. And I will share personally, when Jupiter was in Gemini I think it was in Gemini, end of Taurus, Gemini, entered my 12th house, conjunct my Saturn in Gemini. That's when I had this realization. A book. That's when the Neptune book kind of came through automatic writing. Writing, Gemini, Jupiter, something bigger than me. And and so that makes me realize, I learned things that I did not know by writing them. So that was kind of that transcendental experience that ended up opening new understandings, all of those things. And and so what I'm saying is that it can be through someone, through a teacher. It can be a personal awakening, but it changes you. Not only because you realize new things, but because you suddenly experience yourself as a transcendental being. You're more than your physical form. And as we said, um, the connection, the interplay between Saturn and Jupiter are all about ethics, the rights and wrong. Now, there are always two levels of right and wrong. There's the human level and there's the spiritual level. The human is an attempt to materialize the spiritual. So when you have a law that says fraud will take you to jail, where does it come from? It comes from a spiritual reference. All the laws that are in our democracy, in our legislation systems, are originating from a spiritual source at some point, because it filters down from the cosmic order to the human order. But the human order is always half-baked. It's always imperfect. And that's why human laws have to constantly be rewritten. And then we have issues like abortion, right? Is it right or wrong? Is the fetus deserving to be protected at all costs, like an actual baby? And will a woman who has an abortion, um, is considered an assassin that should face the death penalty? These are questions that are rising when when Saturn squared Jupiter. And so who is right? Those who say women have the choice and the autonomy, or those who say the fetus is voiceless and needs to be protected? To what extent? With Jupiter coming into Leo, and it's going to trine Saturn in Aries, we are very likely going to get into more controversial questions about children, pregnancy, abortion, and new laws. Not just in the United States, it's going to be filtering everywhere. Wherever you have Jupiter and then Saturn, ethical dilemmas are going to be contemplated and explored. So let's get started. And I'm going to just revert back to your questions. We're moving fast. Elizabeth, will you expand on Neptune resonance and inconvenient truth? I'm curious because my Jupiter is conjunct Neptune Scorpio. Absolutely. I mean, that's part of what I was saying. I hope that I answer that question with Jupiter is my interpretation as a fire planet, and Neptune represents the neutral truth that nobody can own but belongs to everyone. We're going to look at examples. If your Jupiter is intercepted in the sixth house, does it become more critical like Virgo? It becomes more critical, but not because it's intercepted. It's just because it's in the sixth house. The interception doesn't necessarily aggravate it. But it's a good question. We're going to go through Jupiter in Virgo, but we talked about the fact that Sagittarius squares Virgo in the natural wheel. So what happened if Jupiter is in Virgo? That's exactly what is going on, is that people with Jupiter in Virgo are going to be much more careful about excesses. They are going to regulate themselves more consciously. So they are likely not those who will end up here, because a Jupiter in Virgo or in the sixth house is a Jupiter that is under analysis, that wants to be productive. And so it's going to be more careful about resources, about the body, about how to expand in a sustainable way. Virgo is going to bring attention to sustainability. I have Moon and Jupiter in Sag. My mom was very loud, critical, oppressing my self-expression. Now that she's 94, she has changed into passive-aggressive attitude. Yeah. Um, so I think I got most of your questions. Thank you for sharing and participating. So does Saturn conjunct Jupiter create more restriction? Can you speak about these two planets conjunct? I have them in Libra in the first house. So just keep in mind that when you have a conjunction, and this is something, I'm going to teach about next week. Is it next week? Yeah, May 17. If you're interested, um, there are a couple of events that I'm gonna bring aspects. Let me share this. So on May 17, I'm going to speak about aspects, and I'm going to talk about how, such a thing, such as Jupiter Saturn conjunction can work. If you can't attend, you can also get the recording. Um, the first thing you do is you see Jupiter Saturn, what brings them together? They're both the teachers. They're both telling us about the rights and wrong. They both represent our cultural conditioning. So people with a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction are people who are usually teachers. They usually have that, trustworthy presence of wisdom, capacity, sometimes academic achievement. So there's something about a Jupiter Saturn presence that can show mastery. And usually, those born during that conjunction are masters in their field. But then we see what brings the two planets together. We have to ask where's the tension is. The tension is between the fate and free will. So people with Saturn, Jupiter will always periodically, when that is activated by another transit, will have to go through phases where they ask themselves, is it right what I'm doing? Questions about integrity are going to be central for Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. If people around them are out of integrity, or if they test their own integrity, is going to be important. Um, so that's in a nutshell. So let's start with Jupiter in Aries. We already touched on it. What about someone else's Saturn conjunct our Jupiter? The combination of force issues integrity between the two people. There can be questions of what's right and wrong between the two people. And it may be that one will preach, and give sermons to the other about what's right and wrong. And there could be debates about that. Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. I need to get water. I'll be right back. You can pause the recording. So, Beth, we'll get to your question when when we get to Cancer. Thank you. Back to Jupiter in Aries. So think about these keywords, right? Um, Sovereignty, truth and authenticity, and daring. People with Jupiter in Aries, and that also applies to Jupiter in the first house and Jupiter-Mars aspects. And this is very relevant to our year 2026 because we're going to have a Jupiter-Mars conjunction in November in Leo. It's a very dramatic conjunction because it's going to be on the North Node and in Leo on the South Node. So let me show you the chart. So you see here this Mars, Jupiter, South Node exact conjunction, squaring the Sun. So when I speak about Jupiter in Aries, it brings that flavor of a Jupiter Mars. So where is the sovereignty? One of the messages of Jupiter in Aries is indeed what we mentioned earlier. Nobody will control me. nobody will silence me. And I will express myself as authentically as I can. And these are obviously individuals who have, very strong willpower. Talk about free will, agency, and independence. Their spirit, is untamable. There's something wild in a Jupiter in Aries, which cannot be restrained, but must be worked with. So if you're a parent to a Jupiter in Aries child or a Jupiter in the first house, it is dynamite. It is has tremendous intensity, but it is so powerful and self-governing, and that autonomy can indeed be very, very creative. So the message of I can and I will is part of it. Remember that wherever your Jupiter is where your faith and your ideologies are. So when Jupiter is in the first house, Aries or Mars, your faith drives your action. Action, Aries. Your ideology drives your action. So if you have faith in something, you are unstoppable because you have such strong conviction. And these are people who can move mountains, who can be elected a third time. These are those who will not accept no for an answer. And quite often, there's something in that wildness that is also very pure. It's very primal. It doesn't go through filters of who do I need to please, or it's not strategic. It's instinctive. And so if you have that in your chart, connect with your wildness. Embrace the wildness, the wild animal in you. This also takes me to understanding that Jupiter, is represented by the horse, by the eagle, and it's part of the challenge of Jupiter and Sagittarius to combine the animal and the poet. So there's something very bestial in this configuration. And there's also something that's very aware, conscious, spiritual. And this is why Sagittarian folks, Jupiterian folks, and especially in fire signs, are sometimes fighting between the human and the beast. Should I let things out? Should I unleash? Should I say what I say without restraint? Or should I be more uh, conscientious, more careful, more strategic? So the Jupiter in Aries may feel that more strongly, but usually the beast wins. And that is what, as an astrologer, you need to encourage that because it's part of what's true for them. I know a scientist who has Jupiter-Mars opposition in Aries, and he seems unusually strategic. That's unusual indeed, and I wonder if he's very argumentative. I was born on the 9th of a month, and I have Jupiter in Aries. So you can share if you have one of these placements, some anecdotes would be, it's always good to learn from direct experience. What I also want to highlight with Jupiter in Aries is the freedom fighters, those who do not accept oppression and will speak out, sometimes at the risk of being brutalized. Um, Remember, for example, that in 2010, 2011, when the Arab Spring erupted, Jupiter was at 28 Pisces, just on the tail end of Aries, conjunct Uranus in Aries, and it led to this unique, never before revolution of people hitting the streets, feeling that they could not take oppression any longer. And that started, look at the Aries symbolism. It started with um, a fellow in Tunisia who felt oppressed by the regime, a sense of injustice, and set himself on fire. And that led to protests. It inflamed, the whole country. It led to the change of regime in Tunisia, in Egypt, etc. So that is, a representation of Jupiter in Aries. Um, so there's intensity and there's honest, blunt, very sometimes vulgar expression. So this is the chart of Che Guevara. The time of birth is questioned, but you see his Jupiter in the first house, otherwise in Aries, along with Uranus, Mars. And so, it's Jupiter in Aries, people cannot pretend. They cannot, live a double life. They're very transparent because of that primal instinct. And so he's, the symbol of the freedom fighting movement. And then how he pushed everybody's button to the point of being eventually killed, executed. I've always spoken out in such a way for underdog. I will even stop my vehicle if I see someone being abused in some manner. Exactly. My son is in Jupiter in the first. He's so determined, conjunct his moon. He's very compassionate, always helping the oppressed. My son Jupiter in Aries in the 12th certainly goes his own way. So, it's interesting to see parents who have kids with that because the kids can sometimes, you know, be hard to control, so to speak. They're going to speak up, they're not going to easily comply. And that is both a gift, but also, I know, it's a challenge. You will also see, and that's a kind of the funny side, and I don't know if you can resonate, but Jupiter in Aries can have a really sometimes they curse. They know all the bad words, and when they're upset, it's not going to be diplomatic. And so this kind of full language and sometimes vulgar, it can be over the top. Is kind of the excess of Jupiter in Aries, um, not being formal in any way. But immense creativity, as we said. So, as we speak about later this year, when Mars is going to um, conjunct Jupiter in Leo, think of Mars Jupiter as a bulldozer. It's it's the power of conviction with action. In its positive side, it's about empowerment, and it's empowerment of the oppressed, of those who were silenced, etc. So later this year, we may see movements of protest. We may see people rising against authoritarianism. But we may also see the shadow side, which is religious wars, because Jupiter brings the religion and Mars brings the battle. So you believe that God is with you as you slaughter people, and you feel justified. Jupiter is your feeling that you can explain why you're doing what you're doing. There's a reason, Jupiter. So you don't need to apologize because it's coming from a higher mind, so to speak. Yeah, it's basically pretty much during the US elections. I mean, it's exact on the 15, but it's already in orb during the midterm elections. And Mars, Trump's Mars is 26 Leo. So for him, it's a Mars return on Jupiter South Node. I'm going to talk about these transits on July 3rd. I have scheduled a transit analysis of 2026, the second part two. So there's no problem with truth and authenticity here, but keep in mind that Jupiter in Aries can come from a place where they felt that other people try to stop them. This is why they are reactive, or they can be reactive, because there's a past life memory of injustice, of silencing. And with Aries, the message is no more. I'm not going to take it any longer and oblige or comply. Um, when they have their experience that opens them up, it's usually something that's so powerful. A spiritual awakening will be like a jolt, will be um, completely transformative because Aries and Jupiter is total. It's not partial. It's all or nothing. And so when there's a realization, it's a complete experience. It consumes them entirely. That is true for anything that they do. Their passion is usually consuming them. So they cannot lie to themselves. They cannot sit in an office if it's against their integrity and do a job that they do not believe in. Everything that they do, they need to believe in it. And as we say, the compass, if they see a lack of integrity, they're going to zoom in and charge. They will be the whistleblowers. Okay? I have left job based on integrity, and you have that, right? What about Jupiter in the eighth house or the 12th house? Would that instinctual Mars Jupiter be connected to transcendence and less primal? Absolutely. I mean, you always have to analyze a chart with all the different factors that can color your story. If you have Jupiter in Aries and it's a square Saturn, then the rage can be intensified because the memory of oppression is more immediate. Um, I had a client whose child, she had a child that was uncontrollable, and that child had Sun, Jupiter, conjunct in Aries in the first house. So imagine Jupiter in the first, Jupiter in Aries, and then the Sun is right there as well. And this kid, and the backdrop is that this was a very conservative family where, the father's a lawyer, mother is kind of this good wife at home. And so very traditional and correct. Everything was correct with them. And then they have this child who is a ball of fire. Not only that, but in an Aries way, he was from age, as soon as he could stand up and walk, he went to the knives. He was obsessed with sharp objects. And he just, saw himself as this warrior. And, usually kids with, at that age have still a strong influence from past lives. So it filters through and they don't know what overwhelms them, but it is often a continuation of their past lives. And so what the parents ended up doing, this kid was like this uncontrollable energy and at times very confrontational. So my advice was, of course, take him to the arts, let him use colors, outdoors and all that energy to channel the Jupiter in Aries Sun more productively. But they chose medication. And so they subdued him and he turned into a zombie in front of TV. And it was so crazy to see how they pulled that force out of him. Um, And he became, of course, very, very self-conscious, along with not trusting his instincts. But, I have faith that, I said they're untamable. In this case, he was tamed. And the reason is that Mars was opposing Saturn in his chart. So the ruler of that Jupiter, Mars, opposing Saturn led to control. But I suspect that with the right transit, he will, you know, get out of that shell and break free. So I want to continue, and if we're going to use examples to explore that, but if we want to go through all the signs, better catch on. So Taurus, second house, and Venus. This is a very interesting combination because if we look at the natural wheel, Jupiter is about transcendence, Taurus is about the material world. So you have this interesting fusion of energies where ideology, faith, meaning is now transported or affiliated or directed towards matters of financial sustainability, integration into the material world. And how to, if we speak of Jupiter in the second house or Jupiter Venus or Jupiter Taurus, is how to balance the spiritual with the material in a most immediate way. If we speak about a good expression of Jupiter in Taurus is being able to make money from spiritual practices. So it's the ability to bring a physical manifestation, a value, Taurus, to your wisdom and teachings and whatnot. But until you reach that point where it's working well, there may be a lot of ideological battles. So what can happen is that they may swing from too material to rejecting materialism. It's sometimes like having a war with money and having all kinds of ideologies, thoughts, beliefs around what money represents. And is it good or bad? So we talk about integrity, rights and wrongs. There can be a lot of dilemma about, is it okay to charge money for spiritual things? What should I charge? So you can have people with Jupiter in Taurus who are going to make a lot of money because they are believing in the material aspect of things and in pushing boundaries of value. So if you believe in the value of your service or in your own value, then it can mean that you're a good salesperson, that you can bring abundance. But there will often be questions around integrity and money. Whether you see it around you and you're becoming very sensitive to people abusing money, or you are yourself facing dilemmas about what is my value and can I measure my talents, you know, through material means. So, an interesting, difficult example of Jupiter in Taurus is Jeffrey Epstein. Now, I'd like to ask you, when you look at this chart, what do you see in this Jupiter in Taurus in his life? How does it come about? And do you believe this Jupiter is powerful in this chart? Is it dominant or not? And why would it be? Squaring the nodes, dominant, absolutely. Yeah. It's a very strong Jupiter. The IC is your core identity. So when a planet conjunct an angle, it dominates. When a planet is on the nodes, square the nodes, it dominates. So this Jupiter is, a big agent here of all the drama and the karma. And think about the integrity related to money. Number one, how wealthy he was to even own an island. Think about island land. We tend to think about island as Pisces, but it's also my own piece of land. I have no neighbors. So that kind of Taurus Jupiter in the fourth house, it's like my home is this huge physical property. But then the question, what else do we see in the story of his life? Incredible wealth that came, we're not sure how, right? It's very mysterious and definitely legal issues around how he got so wealthy. Now, what else is in Taurus? We talk about financial things, but Taurus is anything physical, which also includes your own body. So people with Jupiter in Taurus can also have many beliefs that are affecting their own connection to their body and sexuality. Okay. So what other things you see here is every issue that we talk about when we speak about um, Jeffrey Epstein is massages. How the girls, were invited to give him massages. Taurus is massage. And it's in his home. And so you see how the sensuality, the abuse of women and young girls in this kind of Jupiterian glamour context of islands and wealth and beauty and famous people, the glitter became a honey trap. So that is part of the power of Jupiter is the honey trap. The honey trap of the young girls seduced by money and opportunity, and the honey trap of all these politicians and public figures who were seduced by, the girls and whatnot, all these generosity. So when we're going to talk, at Omega, uh, I mentioned Merriman speaking about the honey and the bees, the sting and the honey is part of Jupiter. It's part of his upbringing. But it shows in particular with uh, Jupiter in Taurus. Okay. And you can obviously see from that how it became a karmic liability. That this Jupiter, with all the glamour and the glitter and the honey trap, became the source of abuse, the source of karmic consequences. And when was he arrested the final time? When Saturn was in Capricorn on his ascendant. It was, finally, put in jail for good. So, how about charisma with Pluto in Leo? Do people describe him as charismatic? I mean, I suspect he had a lot of appeal, but Pluto in Leo in the eighth house is actually, remember what we talked about when we look at the natural wheel, right? Is that the eighth house is a point of crisis. It's where you have to face your limitations and your own death. So it's a point where you have to learn your spiritual lessons or die. So people with Pluto in the eighth house are usually people who fear rejection. They feel unloved. They're not so confident. So deep down, you know, he was not a happy, confident person, but he compensated with this Jupiter by, trying to impress people and giving them gifts and all this kind of the word is indulgence and yeah. Now another example in a different way and perhaps a more positive way. Oh, in 1940 and 41, Jupiter was in Taurus and it was conjunct Saturn. So it was one of these 20-year cycle of Jupiter Saturn. And it brought these masterful musician, singers, songwriters. Their list is long. There are actually many more of them. But these are just a representation. John Lennon, Bob Dylan, Joan Bays. I don't know exactly how to say her name. So she was, Dylan's partner as well, but they brought a lot of soul in their music. And something that was also transcendental. So Taurus's music, harmonies, the natural talent of being able to sing or being able to play instruments. But Jupiter and Saturn also bring an element again of mastery, the teacher. And the teacher here is going to be in something artistic, something physical, not in knowledge. Bias, bias. Okay. So when people are born with Jupiter and Saturn, if you think about the teacher, you're not just going to teach intellectually or, um, recite whatever verses. The experience, the embodiment is going to be part of your teaching. And what better way to do that than with art and music? Um, and so that's part of this interplay between the physical and the spiritual. Another interesting example, recent in the news, is this lady, Canadian actress Claire Brosseau, who was very successful, generally speaking, grew up, as she said, in a nice, loving, supportive family. But she suffers from mental health issues. I believe it is bipolar condition. And she abused drugs, alcohol, very heavily, especially until her Saturn return, which is in the sixth house of sobriety. But now she's bringing an ethical dilemma about assisted suicide. So, legally, assisted suicide is allowed in Canada for physical suffering, for terminal physical diseases. And she is bringing this to court to also include mental health conditions. So she's otherwise physically fine, but she doesn't want to live and wants to die and has tried to commit suicide herself, but could not succeed. And a few things about this. I know I'm going to start by saying that to begin with, Pisces, Sun, and Neptunian people are not comfortable incarnating. So the aspiration to end this already is very Piscean. There's also this tight Mars, Uranus, Saturn T-square in each other's sign, right? Mars and Uranus are in this kind of mutual reception, which is something to analyze, to think about, especially as Mars rules her south node. Yeah. So my question to you is, what's the role of Jupiter moon in Taurus here in this big drama of a controversial uh, plea to die? The transcendence of the body. Exactly. So how would you unpack that, Maria? But why choosing to leave the body? What is going on in the mind with Jupiter and Taurus, and then the moon there as well? Moon, body, Jupiter expansion of her cries. The moon is not the body. Taurus is the body. The body is Earth. So usually the Earth sign represent how we feel in our body, the management of the body, health issues, Virgo, it's all Earth signs. Moon represents, all our needs. So it has to do with how we manage our needs, liberating from the limits of the physical realm. So, yes, she does not want to be here as painful integration of the body. So, what you see, in this chart is the opposite of the Epstein example. In Jeffrey Epstein, you saw an indulgence of the senses, excessive pleasure seeking, and the island and the wealth and the girls and the glitter and the comforts. So you had an orgy of Taurus with Epstein. Here, it's the exact opposite. It's it's abstinence. It's restrictive. Yeah. What is she really saying by failing so many times? She wants an outside authority to make a decision for her. I think there's that. But I want to just tap into the Jupiter in Taurus and bring to your attention that whatever we believe in, Jupiter, is going to affect how we feel in our body. So I mentioned that we often have a spiritual awakening through loss, death, and failure. And so there's something about Jupiter not feeling that the body supports the spirit. There's a war between the body and the spirit. And that enhances, especially with the moon there. When you have a moon Jupiter, people are emotionally attached to their beliefs. Again, strong conviction. It's very primal. It's a deep need. And so for her, she gets into this mindset, this belief that this is the end of it, that the physical incarnation is suffering. And so there is a this discord between the body and the spirit. That's how important that Jupiter in Taurus is in this chart. And that is also part of the reason why, this physical existence feels such a painful experience. Because as an actress, someone who experienced success. She had a lot of, a strong spirit, but it also always felt to her that the body was failing. She had eating disorders. So when you have that moon conjunct Jupiter, you can suspect excessive food purging, excessive food purging. And that exacerbated her physical condition, that exacerbated her mental condition. So indeed, Jupiter is a liberator looking at, trying to liberate from the physical. What else you can see, with Jupiter in Taurus is people who will have a lot of thoughts and ideas about what to eat, what is right to eat. And there's going to be an ideology, a belief associated with food, a belief associated with sexuality, a belief associated with money. So all the physical aspect of Taurus, material, whether it's the body, the sex, the food, the money, are going to be flavored by an ideology. So I had this client who had Jupiter in Taurus, and her greatest joy was fasting. Because for her, fasting was a way, to experience the physical and transcend it. It was a way to free herself from food and the overconsumption of food by going to the other extreme of not eating. So it was not anorexia. It was not, a an emotional issue as much as a spiritual issue. And her meals were minimal. So obviously very picky because Jupiter wrote a whole book in her head about the meaning of food. Of course, fasting can be healing. But what I want to say is that whatever your method, when Jupiter is in Taurus, there is going to be many strings attached. Think about Jupiter, wherever Jupiter is, there's a story. It's not coincidence. It doesn't come just by itself. So if you have Jupiter in Taurus in the second house or with Venus, there's a story attached to the narrative of your food, to what sex means to you, to what money means to you. So you have on the one hand people who can manifest abundance with Jupiter in Taurus, and you have those who believe money is evil and corrupting, and they're going to actually reject financial abundance. So what I want to say is wherever your Jupiter is, it's not a one size fits all. It depends what stage of it you're in, how conscious you are, and what's your conditioning. But always remember the key words are there's a belief attached to this. There's an ideology that drives the decisions here. Okay? So we're going to close with that today. Jupiter in the second house, I'm obsessed with what I eat. I think of the poor who have nothing to eat and sometimes reduces my portion to experience their suffering. That's very Jupiter in the second house. So that's an interesting sharing because again, it brings ideology, but it also brings, the consciousness about waste and abuse and Pisces and thank you. Thank you, everyone. Until next week.
Thank you, Maurice. I'm sorry for keeping you here longer.
No,
But yeah,
I'm
it's
sorry for keeping you longer.
oh no problem. But next week we will continue with have some signs. I
Yeah.
hope you feel better next week, Maurice.
Please.
Please rest. Maybe you
Thank
can
you.
find a special belt or something. And see
Take
you.
good care. Bye bye.
You too. Bye bye.